What's going on? YouTube. Listen up, young elder gang. This is Shoeshine Joe at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video. Fam, I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes in this video. You will find history definitions, scripture information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning. The truth, keep in mind this. Content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button. Young Elder Gang, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. The story we're told is simple, a moment of liberation. On June 19, 1865, Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, announcing the end of so-called slavery and the Civil War. But this narrative is false. The celebration of freedom, which was an illusion. One storyline is that a so-called slave was working under the house fixing some pipes under the kitchen of Master's house. He overheard some white people talking about Lincoln had ended the war on paper with the Native Americans and that they could no longer be their Christian property. They cried and boo-hoo about it. Who's going to work the fields? They felt they had too much class to pick cotton. We are going to lose everything because of Lincoln and his slick talking up north slang. They say this so-called slave that heard this ran from under the house and told everybody and their dog that the so-called slaves were free. The war is over. This was a story created to steal a people's identity, land, and to dispossess them. To understand freedom, we must also confront what and who was erased. Propaganda isn't just loud slogans or wartime posters. The most effective propaganda is the slavery story narrative, a story told so often it becomes true. The United States has mastered this art, crafting a national mythology of freedom and exceptionalism. This mythology hides the brutal realities of its founding: genocide, land theft, and erasure. The Civil War was to steal Native Americans' land out west. It was a complex and devastating event with widespread consequences for the Native American population. The Civil War accelerated and intensified the process of land dispossession from Native American tribes. The conflict was used as a pretext for further westward expansion and so-called enslavement of Native peoples on their ancestral lands. The Union and Confederate governments exploited existing tensions and alliances within Native American tribes to further their own goals. Some tribes were coerced or persuaded into siding with one faction against the other, based on promises of land or protection that were ultimately not fulfilled. The war served as a justification for them to bring in foreigners to replace the real indigenous people with. They designed reservations for these foreigners, who they trained. Then they created acts to play out on the world stage, like they had moved the real indigenous people off their land. Listen, this is the biggest land heist ever. This would further disrupt tribal societies, economies, and cultural practices. The Civil War led to increased violence and conflict between Native American tribes and both the Union and Confederate forces. The conflict was used as an excuse to suppress and reclassify all Native tribes in the Louisiana Purchase and farther west, to cut off Native Americans, indigenous resistance to westward expansion, and land claims from the USA Corporation. The Civil War facilitated the exploitation of valuable resources on Native American lands, such as gold, minerals, and timber. Both sides of the conflict were incentivized to seize control of these resources, further enriching themselves at the expense of Native communities. The story of Juneteenth, as popularly told, is a masterpiece of this kind of propaganda. It takes a staged event and elevates it into a national symbol of freedom's triumph. But in doing so, it distracts from the foundational crimes of the USA Corporation. It encourages a limited understanding of history. The problem was slavery of the Native Americans, who were really prisoners of war, and they said they ended it. They didn't end slavery, they just made the plantation bigger. It ignores that the United States is a colonizing colonial state, built on the reclassification of indigenous peoples to steal their land. This propaganda works by narrowing our focus, debating the legacy of chattel slavery, not colonialism. The land becomes a passive backdrop, its original inhabitants rendered silent. This is not accidental, it's a deliberate strategy to control the narrative. By making Juneteenth central to the story of so-called Black freedom, the state appears progressive, acknowledging a past wrong. But it does so in a way that reinforces its own legitimacy, never questioning its right to the land or the violence of its expansion. The propaganda is successful because it feels like truth, like justice, but it is a carefully managed lie, offered on stolen ground. The real history is hidden in plain sight. The story we celebrate is propaganda and misdirecting. The rest is buried beneath the myth. To see clearly, we must look beyond the official narrative. We must ask, whose freedom, whose land, and what is left out of the story? The Louisiana Purchase is taught as a peaceful bargain, but the land belonged to native nations, never consulted or paid. The deal ignored indigenous existence, setting a precedent for dispossession. The true cost was paid by those who were never asked. The land remembers even if textbooks do not. The United States Corporation was tricked out of land by France. In this transaction with France, signed on April 30th, 1803, the United States purchased 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River for $15 million. For roughly 4 cents an acre, the United States doubled its size, expanding the nation westward. Napoleon only sold the streets of New Orleans and a military barracks. The rest of Louisiana was stolen from the Washita people. There weren't actually even a lot of French in the Louisiana territory. In fact, the bigger outrage came from Native Americans, who basically owned the land and thought the French didn't have the right to proclaim it theirs, let alone sell it. The only significant French population was in New Orleans and other cities on the Gulf of Mexico. The New World was as much a colonial venture for the French as it was a monetary one. They were mainly interested in the fur trade, fishing, lumber, and other materials to rob the Native Americans out of. Despite this, there wasn't a huge amount of backlash from the French. USA Corporation people came to the bargaining table with France because they wanted New Orleans. Lots of USA Corporation people were pushing into it, and it was creating conflict. So, when France sold it, it was pretty easy for USA Corporation people to move in, and the French population there to shrug their shoulders and continue what they were doing. Now with more people to buy their trade goods and an entirely new market opened up in the North and South. They act like the Native American weren't there. There was some illegal fur trapping done by some French after the purchase, but they had such a little foothold in America in the first place that they quickly faded out, especially after the fall of Napoleon to the British Moors. Napoleon only sold the streets of New Orleans and a military barracks. They used the military barracks to take tactical command of the Native Americans Intake Center, which was Olanola, New Orleans. Before the French founded the city of New Orleans in 1718, the area where it is now located was called Bulbancha by the Native American tribes who inhabited the region. The name Bulbancha is of Choctaw origin and translates to land of many tongues. This name reflects the diverse population and vibrant cultural exchange that occurred in the area before European arrival, as it was a significant gathering place for various indigenous tribes for trade, alliances, and hunting. They needed a plan to get the Native Americans off their land but couldn't move them. They remembered the Black Code tactic issued by King Louis XIV of France. The USA Corporation got the idea from France of rebranding. They needed a way to make it look like the Native Americans had left their land. So they used the France Christian Black Codes to reclassify the Native Americans as blacks, Negroes, and colored. They implemented policies aimed at forcing Native Americans to abandon their traditional ways of life, including language, religion, and cultural practices. The plan was to declare land abandoned if Native people are no longer seen practicing their traditional customs, even if they are still physically present on the land and calling themselves some else other than their original name. They didn't care about this no way, because under the doctrine of discovery, if you're not Christian, you're a savage. Imagine a specific ritual or ceremony tied to a piece of land is deemed crucial to proving ownership by the dominant society. If Native people are prevented from practicing this ceremony due to policies of assimilation, their claim to the land could be considered invalid or abandoned in the eyes of the dominant power. The created policies aim to dismantle traditional communal land ownership systems and replace them with individual allotments, as seen in the historical context of the Dawes Act. This shift was used to facilitate the transfer of land from Native individuals to white colonizers, making it seem like the land was being bought or developed, rather than seized. The Native people are forced to accept individual land allotments, and are then unable to manage or cultivate them according to the dominant society's standards. This was used as a pretense to declare the land unused or abandoned, and then make it available for sale. They worked to undermine or eliminate tribal governments and institutions, diminishing the collective power of Native communities to assert their land rights. They didn't recognize tribes who wouldn't make a treaty with them. Those tribes that wouldn't make a deal were marked as outlaw tribes. The term outlaw Indian tribe refers to specific Native American individuals or groups who engaged in criminal activities by making money on their own land without giving the Crown and the Pope a cut by paying taxes, and who resisted U.S. government colonization and were labeled as hostiles or renegades. These individuals or groups were not recognized by the Indian Bureau of Affairs. Keep in mind, the USA Corporation wiped out Native American tribal governments, which are not recognized as legitimate entities with the authority to manage and protect their ancestral lands. It made it easier to justify the claim that the land is abandoned or unmanaged. The USA government refuses to recognize the legal authority of a tribal council to make decisions about land use. They declared the land abandoned, effectively without a governing body, and therefore open to exploitation and colonizers in their view. The USA Corporation redefined Native American identity and relationship to the land in a way that serves their own interests of acquisition and control. This involved manipulating legal frameworks, imposing foreign concepts of ownership, and suppressing Native cultural practices and creating Black freedom propaganda stories to promote misdirection. The goal was to create the illusion of abandonment, even when Native people were still present and connected to their ancestral territories. Once they reclassified the Native Americans as Blacks, Negroes, and colored. During the war, many Native Americans left their homes to fight in the Native Wars, versus the USA Corporation on the East Coast. They marked the land as abandoned, as they sent Lewis and Clark on the Lewis and Clark Expedition, also known as the Corps of Discovery Expedition, which was a U.S. government-funded exploration of the Louisiana Purchase from 1804 to 1806. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. With the help of Ben York, who spoke several Native American languages, the expedition aimed to survey the newly acquired territory, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, and establish trade and sovereignty over the native populations. The expedition is a landmark event in American history, significantly expanding knowledge of the western United States. Meriwether Service was a private military company and security contractor, survey and census business. The census part is important because what Lewis and Clark, who were secret lovers, was supported to do is take a survey and census on the land and mark Native Americans down as Black. A census worker, also known as a census enumerator or census taker, is an employee of the U.S. Census Bureau who collects data during a census or other surveys by visiting households. They are hired from local communities and are responsible for contacting households that have not yet responded to the census or survey and completing the questionnaires. They primarily focus on collecting data from households that haven't responded online, by phone, or by mail. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, also known as the Corps of Discovery Expedition, was the United States expedition to cross the newly acquired western portion of the country after the Louisiana Purchase. The Corps of Discovery Expedition was the USA Corporation using the doctrine of discovery to steal the natives' land. Officially commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, their mission was to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory and find a navigable water route to the Pacific Ocean. The expedition also aimed to establish census and sovereignty over the Native American tribes encountered by marking them down as Blacks and colored. Dred Scott was a Native American who got reclassified as Black and colored and lost his rights. The final decision on Dred Scott case was delivered on March 6, 1857. 8 of the 9 justices wrote separate opinions. 7 justices, primarily pro-Southern, followed individual lines of reasoning that led to a shared opinion that, by law, Dred Scott was still a Black slave and had no standing in law. The term colored was officially changed to slave in 1865 to run game during the early 19th century in the United States, particularly after the Civil War. The term colored was adopted by emancipated slaves as a term of racial pride and was used until the mid-20th century, when it was largely replaced by Black or African American. This shift reflects a change in how racial identity was understood and expressed during and after the Reconstruction era. Erasure of Native identity wasn't just violence, it was law. Colonial powers used legal codes to redefine who was who. The French Code Noir, established in Louisiana in 1724, regulated enslaved Native Americans and imposed its racial categories on them. The French started the Code Noir. Noir means black in French. The French planned to steal their nationality, therefore rendering the indigenous people stateless. The plan was crafty: call them a byword. In a legal context, while the term byword isn't a specific legal term with a fixed definition, it can be used to describe someone or something that has become closely associated with a particular quality, especially a negative one, to the point of being a common phrase or example. In the Bible, a byword generally refers to a person, place, or thing that is used as a subject of scorn, ridicule, or a cautionary example. It often signifies a negative association, a reputation for disgrace, or a consequence of disobedience to God's commands. The byword was black in color. There were too many Native Americans, so the system absorbed them by reclassifying them. Some indigenous people were captured and enslaved as prisoners of war, or intermarried with Moors were often legally reclassified as colored or black. Their native identity was stripped away by law, a deliberate strategy. By erasing their legal status as indigenous to Turtle Island, the state erased their claim to land. If you were legally black, you couldn't claim rights under treaties or as part of a native nation. The U.S. expanded these practices after the Louisiana Purchase, spreading its racial logic. The one-drop rule became a weapon. Anyone with Moorish ancestry was legally black. This rule was applied to many native communities, especially in the east and southeast. An entire tribe could be reclassified, their land declared abandoned and opened for white colonizers. Change the people's identity on paper, then take their land. This legal alchemy broke kinship ties and forced people to lose their birthrights. A person could be culturally Choctaw, but if a census taker decided they were colored, their tribal connection was severed. This was not accidental, it was the point. The law became a weapon of dispossession. Paper genocide was as devastating as physical violence. The erasure was written into the law. The American narrative about slavery is reverse. We're taught to imagine ships crossing the Atlantic and African chattel slaves, who were really Moors. But this is a lie, a part of the big propaganda game. African Moors were taking so-called white people, the pale man, as slaves, who are the Slavic. But native peoples were the ones who later got enslaved on their own land as well. Few African Moors were brought to America as slaves. The Native Americans were not chattel, but prisoners of war. They fought to defend their homelands and, when captured, were forced into labor. This distinction matters. Prisoners of war are members of sovereign nations. Colonists and the U.S. government understood this, even if they denied it. The word slave can't apply to Native Africans or Native Americans. Enslaving Native people was a tool of counterinsurgency, breaking resistance to colonial advance. By labeling these prisoners as slaves, the state stripped them of political status. They became property, not soldiers from rival nations. This justified reclassification, permanent bondage, and land seizure. It also created a convenient narrative. The Native Americans faded away and became black enslaved people. This lie hides the Prolonged War of Conquest. The story that Native Americans were enslaved and reclassified as blacks, Negroes, and colored persists. They keep money in the so-called Black Negro Leader Guide's pocket to keep the I'm Black and Proud game going. Black History Month is another propaganda machine just like Juneteenth. Get this in your mind. Abraham Lincoln never freed no slaves. He just transfers Christian stock to Congress. The lies must stop. The truth of indigenous enslavement was widespread, a key tactic in the war for the continent. They were not chattel from afar. They were prisoners from the land being stolen. They used the French idea of reclassification. That's why in 1865 they brought back the Black Codes. Because they couldn't get the Native Americans off their land, they wouldn't leave. Black Codes were restrictive laws passed by Southern states after the Civil War to limit the freedom and rights of newly freed Native American, who were now being called African slaves who came from Africa on a slave ship. More propaganda. These codes, enacted in 1865 and 1866, aimed to maintain the social and economic order of the antebellum South, often forcing Native Americans, who now were black people, into a system resembling slavery. This story is erased from the mainstream narrative. The war for the land was fought with chains as well as guns. The erasure of Native Americans into blacks is part of the larger erasure of indigenous history. To understand so-called American freedom, we must wake up to the truth. Jim Crow laws began to emerge after the Civil War, specifically in the late 1870s, and were enforced through the mid-20th century. These state and local statutes enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. The term Jim Crow referred to the practices, laws, or institutions that physically separated Native American people who had been reclassified as black people from white people. Following the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, Southern states enacted laws to restrict the rights and freedoms of newly freed reclassified Native Americans. While the exact start date varies by state, many Jim Crow laws began appearing in the 1870s. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. This Supreme Court case upheld the legality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation in various public facilities, including schools, transportation, restaurants, and restrooms. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 legally dismantled the Jim Crow system, although its effects continued to be felt for many years. The westward migration of many Native Americans, known as the Exodusters movement, was a direct response to the harsh realities and oppressive conditions they faced in the South after the so-called Emancipation. The South, in the aftermath of the Civil War, continued to be plagued by racial discrimination, Jim Crow laws, and widespread violence, including lynchings. Many Native American people who had been reclassified as black people sought better economic conditions and non-agricultural jobs in the West, as opportunities in the South were limited by exploitative systems like sharecropping. Some Native Americans moved west with the hope of acquiring land and achieving economic independence, though this was often made difficult by discriminatory practices and limited access to resources. The federal government did encourage westward expansion through various policies like the Homestead Act. These policies were linked to Juneteenth and are designed to deceive Native Americans into thinking they were slaves from Africa and not prisoners of war on their own land. Juneteenth itself became a significant celebration and a symbol of freedom, carried by Native Americans who were now black as they migrated across the country, celebrating the end of the war and life in new spaces away from the racism of the South, not knowing this was propaganda to steal their estate. In the 1800s, the Great Migration of Native Americans from the South to other regions began in the 1870s, with an initial surge of about 40,000 to 60,000 people moving to Kansas and surrounding states. This movement, driven by the desire for better economic opportunities and to escape racial oppression, continued into the 20th century, with increased momentum during World War I. Early westward movement, 1850 to 1860, around 4,000 Native Americans from the South settled in California, particularly in San Francisco and Sacramento. This westward movement continued into the late 19th century, with Native Americans from the South also migrating to the Midwest and other northern cities. Push factors included racial violence, Jim Crow laws, and limited economic opportunities in the South. Pull factors included the promise of land, better jobs, and a less oppressive environment in the North and West. The influx of Native Americans from the South into Kansas in the 1870s led to the creation of organizations like the Freedmen's Relief Association of Kansas, which was a part of the game, which helped with settlement and support. By 1900, Native American framers, who had reclassified as black farmers in Oklahoma, owned 1.5 million acres of land, demonstrating the potential for economic advancement in some areas. Even earlier, Native Americans arrived in California, some as founders of Los Angeles in 1781, and others after so-called slavery ended in Mexico in 1821. After legal and military groundwork the state needed to win hearts and minds, it turned to trusted figures within communities, so-called black leaders, preachers, and officials. The Negro leader guides, their job, promote the new narrative, preach American progress, and bury the past. Teach them they were slaves who came from Africa. These leaders were given influence and resources, becoming census takers and administrators. From the pulpit, they told people to embrace a black identity and forget indigenous roots. They became agents of the system, erasing their own histories. The message was powerful because it came from within. Collaborators enforced new racial categories, ostracizing those who held on to Native heritage. This was psychological warfare, turning communities against themselves. The promise of inclusion was always on the bottom rung. The real goal, finalize Native erasure and secure the land. By paying off select leaders, the state manufactured consent for its colonial project. The propaganda grew from within, taking root in the community. The war against native peoples was fought with guns, but won with paper. The census became a weapon. Census takers could decide your identity with a pen. Choctaw families became colored, Creek communities became Negro, by policy, not error. These records became legal documents used to deny land and tribal rights. The census created a paper trail of erasure, making native peoples disappear on paper. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up tribal lands, dividing them into individual allotments. Surplus land was sold to white settlers. The Dawes Act destroyed tribal sovereignty and forced native people into the American system of private property. Official tribal roles were created, using arbitrary and racist criteria. Those reclassified as black or colored were excluded from roles, denied land and citizenship. The Dawes Act finalized paper genocide. It created a legal class of disappeared Indians, their land now abandoned. The erasure was systematic, not accidental. The bureaucracy did what guns could not. The land was cleared with ink. The American legal system was built to justify theft. Landmark cases and policies created a framework to deny native rights. The 1857 Dred Scott decision ruled only whites were citizens, leaving indigenous peoples who were now reclassified as black in legal limbo. They were subjects, not members, with no rights the state was bound to respect. This allowed for the creation of outlaw tribes, native communities refusing termination or relocation. The state declared them illegitimate, reclassifying them as colored and seizing their land. Lewis and Clark's expedition was the first step, mapping land for conquest, informing native nations of their new status. They gathered intelligence for the coming assault. The process created the legal fiction of abandoned land. Laws and the census erased native identity, reclassifying people as black or colored. With no Indians left on paper, land was declared abandoned and seized. This legal trick enabled massive land grabs with a veneer of legality. Dispossession was not chaos, it was calculated, legalistic erasure. The machinery of law did the work of conquest. The theft was written into the system. Today, Juneteenth continues this legacy of erasure. It's a national holiday of forgetting, celebrating the end of one injustice while ignoring a deeper one. The holiday acts as a smokescreen, hiding the history of settler colonialism and ongoing indigenous dispossession. The effects are not just history, they're present. Native nations still fight for recognition and to reclaim stolen lands. Communities reclassified as black still struggle for their indigenous heritage to be acknowledged. The legal and bureaucratic walls built over a century ago still stand. The propaganda that began with the Louisiana Purchase is still at work in our books, laws, and holidays. By embracing Juneteenth without context, we participate in the erasure. We accept the state's narrative and look away from the crime scene. We celebrate a fake freedom really built on destruction. The true story is more complex and disturbing. The fight for black liberation was used to obscure that they were really the natives and were paper genocide out of history. We must challenge the official narrative and ask, whose freedom? At whose expense? Juneteenth is not the end of the story. It's a single scene in a larger drama. Until we confront the full history, any celebration of freedom is incomplete. The smokescreen must be cleared so we can finally see the truth of the land beneath our feet.